If you can't hear me in the back after a while, just start waving and I'll try to crank up the volume a little bit. I'm very glad to be here in California where I live. Certain people refer to Vermont as Ecotopia East. So although I come from a bioregion very far away, I feel quite at home here. I grew up in central Pennsylvania, so I kind of like cold weather. I've been having a good time. The theme, I gather, of the whole series could be rephrased as something like this, the ancient saying, where there is no vision, the people perish. So there are a few of us who are taking up the challenge of trying to invent or contrive or imagine a vision. And when Bob was speaking, I did think of another attempt. It's called Green Hawaii. It was published by a political scientist at the University of Hawaii named Ira Rohter, R-O-H-T-E-R. It's a very curious book because, unlike mine, it's not not a novel altogether. Half of it is a journalistic account of what life in Hawaii is like, really, underneath the touristic superficials. And then the second part is a fictional attempt to imagine what part of the island of Oahu would look like in the future if it was thoroughly greened, became a sustainable society. And since Hawaii is very different from the Northwest, Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, where my Ecotopia is situated, it has many interesting differences, and of course many cultural differences as well. Now recently, as I think you've been discussing, environmentalism, at least as we've known it recently, has been coming under attack. There's a very famous article by Schellenberger and Nordhaus, which I imagine most of you have read, and I share many of the feelings of insufficiency that they've articulated in that article. In fact, I've been feeling them ever since I wrote Ecotopia, because Ecotopia, you could say it's an environmentalist novel, but not really, rather more than that. And I think the insufficiency that people have been feeling about environmentalism is not only in terms of its results. Barry Commoner remarked, and now this is something like 10 or 15 years ago, that the environmental movement only had achieved two real things, that it had gotten lead out of gasoline and it had banned DDT. And aside from that, the ball game was largely going the other way. But what we must talk about sooner or later, I think, is mobilizing, if society is really to change and become sustainable, it's going to be mobilizing a majority which is capable of changing our political order or the behavior of our political order in very fundamental ways. And one of the things that may make that possible, and then again it may not, I don't pretend to know what's going to happen in the future really, is whether enough people can come to share a vision of an alternative way of living, which is what I've tried to do in the book Ecotopia. But to understand where we are now and think about what might be done, I'd like to go back first and make just a very brief backtrack about where environmentalism came from and what it has evolved into. In the beginnings, of course, it was defensive. It was conservationist, you might say, in the original sense of the word. The first environmental organization that I know of, really, in modern times, was called Save the Redwood League. And it was a bunch of rich Republicans who used to like to take their families on motor excursions from San Francisco south into the great redwood forests on the peninsula down near where Stanford University is. And after a while, they began to realize that the remaining redwoods were being chopped down very fast, and they would soon have no longer any place to picnic. So they decided to buy land, which, as Ted Turner has been reminding us lately, is one of the best ways to save it. And the Sierra Club, which was also had very conservative roots, began in somewhat the same spirit. People who knew and loved the Sierra Range began to realize it was under attack and had to be defended. And from that, they expanded into areas all over first the West and then all over the country. The National Resources Defense Council, as I understand its original history, came from a realization that the Hudson River had been heavily, atrociously polluted and had to be defended, and then later on began to think of trying to restore it. Environmental Defense Fund now having another name, began in a somewhat similar spirit. And we still have narrow, single-purpose organizations of that kind being formed all around us. Through the work on the Buffalo book, my wife and I came into contact with a wonderful group of young people called the Buffalo Field Campaign, whose role in life is to keep buffalo who stray out of Yellowstone Park from getting gunned down by the Montana Department of Wildlife. And of course, everywhere in the country, and indeed the world, there are many local save the whatever campaigns, save certain animals, rivers, forests, and so on. The ecological movement, as distinguished from the environmental movement, then came later with the, how should I say, with the breadth and depth of the environmental science that had been developed until when I began writing Ecotopia in 1971, my main reading matter was actually Science Magazine, the journal of the AAAS, in which all kinds of wonderful work was being done about the relations of the human species to the other species with which we interact, and also began to address ecosystems. Previous to that, I think systems theory had been largely mechanistic, largely physicalistic. But at that period, people began to understand that we had to think in terms of biosystems. And this had spillovers into things like, or spill-intos from things like the Simple Living movement, which came out of entirely different roots. American Friends Service Committee, for example, was one of the first organizations to advocate less consumerist ways of living. Conservation biology as a field, a restorative field, was born along about the same time. Wild Earth magazine, the chief mouthpiece for that kind of work. The idea of deep ecology, I sometimes describe myself as a medium shallow ecologist, but deep ecology was invented along in that period too. And of course, Vermont's own Murray Bookchin, in his very elegant and interesting work on social ecology, was part of this expansion too. In fact, his book, Post-Scarcity Anarchism, was one of the books in my head when I began writing Ecotopia. A field called urban ecology, which is an academic field in a somewhat different sense, began to develop as a movement where people began to understand. One of my buddies in California, Richard Register, was the founder of a group by that name, began to understand that cities are actually less ecologically impactful than rural living, highly dependent on automobiles and other kinds of transportation. Amory Lovins, kind of genius in his way, began to understand that you could talk to the most conservative business people about energy conservation and make them listen if you always had your calculator in your pocket and understood how to show them that energy conservation would save them a great, great deal of money. The restoration movement began to gather steam, initially, I think, on restoring Midwestern prairies, but later extending to rivers, estuaries, marshes, creeks, lakes, and so on, as well as charismatic megafauna like wolves and bears. A third component was what you might call the lifestyle movement, which incorporated some of the simple living ideas and began to think in terms of how we live impacting the natural order. Personal energy conservation began to be something that made sense to people. If we back up 20 years and say, hey, how about compact fluorescent lighting, people would not have known what we were talking about. Now you go to places like Austria, and I suspect Vermont, where you don't see very many non-fluorescent bulbs anymore. People began to think about their diet and understand that their diet has big connections with the way we use the land and our impacts on the land. So vegetarianism and even veganism began to be part of the eco-conversation. Spiritual ideas began to develop in a marked way also, partly through a scientific idea called the Gaia theory, or the Gaia hypothesis of Lovelock and Margolis, but also through the greening of most of the mainstream religions. I spent a half a day recently looking at the websites of all the major religious groupings, including the Greek Orthodox Church, which it might surprise you to learn is among the most advanced in its ecological thinking, and has in Greece many monasteries that are practically self-sustained energy-wise and so on. And this is something that cheers me up a great deal, lately we have even begun to see a split in the American evangelical movement between the people who believe Armageddon is right around the corner and why worry about anything on the earth, and some people who call themselves green evangelicals and talk about the earth in terms of being God's body and we ought to take care of it. We've even had a remarkable development that some of you may know about. It started in Italy called the slow food movement, where people attacked fast food with great gumption and gusto, but talked seriously about the way in which we eat, the manner in which we eat, not only what we eat, but the manner in which we eat being a serious component of whether we are living well. And that has expanded into, in turn, a movement called the slow living movement. And I'm going to come back to that a little later because I think the pace of life is a very important question in our visions of the future. So can all these miscellaneous roots come together and flourish into a large enough tree to become a majoritarian movement that might really change our society? That's the overarching question that I'm going to try to be thinking about here. Now, where did Ecotopia come into all this? Well, it was written early in the transition between environmentalism into ecologism, or the ecological movement, whatever you call it, when it had become apparent that our knowledge of ecosystems and human roles in them was broad enough and solid enough to provide some guidance for how we behaved. The book actually grew out of an article project that I had. I was going to write an article about the scandal of our sewage, because I grew up in a rural community in central Pennsylvania, and I was aware that what we were doing with our sewage was biologically insane. We had this nation full of people eating, excreting, and then we were disposing of the result in any way we could think of. We were putting it in our rivers, we were barging it out to sea, we were burning it, we were doing all kinds of crazy things. In my college years, I had been a devotee of something called general semantics, which was a kind of philosophy invented by a Polish count named Alfred Korzybski, who talked about non-survival behavior. Non-survival behavior. Now, a good example of non-survival behavior is smoking. It's fun, it makes you look sexy, and then you die. So I thought, well, maybe there is such a thing as social non-survival behavior. Maybe societies get addicted to doing things in ways that are suicidal. And we don't have to, in fact, look around too hard to find things like that. And the way in which we were dealing with our sewage struck me as a good example. And I went to the University of Berkeley, is a very large university with very, very amazing libraries. And I went to the sanitary engineering library and looked into the scientific and engineering literature on sewage disposal. And I soon found that there were two reasons why we were not recycling our sewage back onto the land so that we might enjoy the benefits of what in Ecotopia becomes the steady state or stable state system of nutrient recycling. And one of the reasons was that we were allowing industrial concerns to dump all kinds of heavy metals and other toxic materials into the common urban sewage stream, thus making the sewage, the sludge, or whatever was derived from it, dangerous to put back on food crops. The other thing, and that seemed fixable, you could simply make them do something else with their stuff. But what didn't seem fixable was that it was a little cheaper to do what we were doing than to recycle this valuable organic nutrient material, and therefore we would not do it. It was a given in our society that if path A and path B are compared and path A is a little cheaper, that's what you do, path A. You forget about path B, even though path B may be biologically sane and path A biologically insane. And I remember getting very depressed about this and thinking, well, you know, here we have this society of fairly bright people who, in the most literal sense of the word, cannot get their bleep together. So I thought, this is really pretty bad. And I looked around the world, looking at other societies to see whether anybody was doing anything better. And the only people who really were at that time were the Chinese, who were still then a almost entirely non-industrial society. And then, in the way that happens sometimes in people's lives, a light bulb went off in my head, and I began to think, well, if a society that does right by its sewage doesn't exist yet, it's about damn time to invent one. And the first thing I sat down and wrote was the chapter in Ecotopia about the steady state system that they have achieved for turning their sewage into fertilizer back on the land, more food, and so on and so forth, going round and round and round in a relatively closed system with relatively zero loss of nutrients, which became a central article of faith among the Ecotopian people as I gradually depicted them in the book. Oddly enough, sustainability was not a term in current use when I was writing this book, although in my opinion it was authors are usually not modest, so I won't pretend. I think it is the first book to try to portray what a sustainable society might look like. But sustainability at that time was used only in a much more technical sense in forestry management and in fisheries management. In both of these fields you can calculate what a sustainable yield is. You can then either decide to live by it, in which case you will have a sustainable system going on as far as you can see, or you can overexploit the resource and you will end up wrecking it, which is in fact what we have done in most of our forests and most of our fisheries. So what I did through this little example of the sewage, sewage and agriculture system was to begin asking, what if we took biological sustainability and stability and continuation as seriously as we've taken the economic bottom line? The whole rest of the book grew out of thinking, well, if whoever did this thing about sewage was that alert and aware of the ramifications, they do a whole lot of other stuff differently. They do their transportation differently. They do their habitation differently. They do everything differently. And then I began to write the rest of the parts of the book. Now, this kind of prioritizing of biology, or at least equalitizing of biology with economics, was really unprecedented, I think, at the time. And it was just because I was a crazy outsider that I was able to attempt to do it. It's still a minority view, despite the existence of the Institute, and a lot of bright people all over the world trying to cope with the economics of our biological survival. But in my opinion, what we really face in the long run is something like Ecotopia or bust. We either learn to live in many ecotopian ways, or we're going to have a very hard time of it indeed. And the form this question takes very often, I think, is ecology, or are ecological processes nested within economics, in which case economics is all we really need to know, or is economics nested within biology or within ecology, in which case we're going to have to invent a new kind of economics. That's really the fundamental question that I think the Institute is wrestling with, and a lot of people throughout the world are wrestling with. And it's an imperative question, really, because we can see that there is a kind of interesting convergence going on between, soon after I wrote Ecotopia, when Herman Daly, I think it was Herman Daly, came out with a wonderful book called Muddling Toward Frugality. He's an economic geographer, and he began to look ahead and see what kind of a future industrial society faced if we went on the way we were going. And he was not terribly optimistic it could be done. And various extremely serious attempts have been made to run different kinds of scenarios, most of which come out saying something like, either you begin to act pretty much like Ecotopians, or you're in for it, buddy. Now, I want to turn around now and ask why the vision of Ecotopia in the book, which I hope, of course, that you'll all go out and read, why it's been appealing, because it's not obvious. If you simply stand up and say what we ought to have is sustainable energy, sustainable transportation, sustainable this and that, most people will say yes, yes, and move on to their next shopping list. But something about Ecotopia has appealed to an awful lot of people, and I am and I say this with all modesty, I'm only the author, so I don't really know. I mean, I put together this stuff, and it's sort of like a quilt in a certain way. I didn't invent almost anything in the book. There's practically nothing original in the book, and it's very conservative technologically. But what I did was pick up all these pieces from here and there, rather like a quilt maker, and I sewed them together into this pattern you can hang up, and people will evidently look at it and say, gee, that's nice. In fact, if you have them read the book and then some other books about other futures, they will mostly say they'd rather live in Ecotopia. And certainly in terms of the contrast between Ecotopia and Mad Max or Blade Runner or worlds like that, Ecotopia wins hands down. And here are my ideas of why this is true. And I offer this, of course, in the spirit that we are all trying to think of a vision that will be strong enough and beautiful enough and heartwarming enough to appeal to masses of people, not only in our country, but all over the world, because that's what it's really going to take. Certainly there's a very strong element of hope in the book, especially it's a nice place, and young people who read it say, I think this would be neat to live there. It's not a perfect world, it's not a utopia in the ordinary sense, but it offers people hope if they have gotten to a point in their lives, and many young people have, where they begin to have the sense that more stuff is not really a prescription for a healthy, happy future for themselves or for society. Now, it's a short novel. It's also a love story with a happy ending. It's also a tale of personal redemption for the narrator, Will Weston, who is a representative of the West, as you might guess. But I think the fact that the book makes people feel that Humpty Dumpty might be put back together again is a big part of why people like it and why they have passed it on to their friends and used it in classes. And people come up to me sometimes and say, your book changed my life. And I say, I hope for the better. And usually they say it was. Another part of the vision that has to be really apparent, I think, is that it must make sense of our relation to nature or the universe or whatever we call everything that's out there. And people configure that, of course, very differently. Is there a way in which we can feel at home on the planet? Is there a way in which we can feel that we're taking care of it, that we're being responsible about it? Now, the word Ecotopia, and I didn't realize this until I was about to send the thing off to the printer. Eco comes from the Greek root, and I can't pronounce it right, it's something like oikos, which means household or home. And the Greeks lived in expanded families, so this was probably a pretty big establishment. Topos was Greek for, of course, we have many words that end in that. It means place. So Ecotopia really means literally home place. And although I wasn't conscious of it at the time I was writing it, that's a very important element of it. The Ecotopians, and they're a small country, not as small as Vermont, but they are a small country occupying a very well-defined bioregion along the Pacific coast, and called the Cascadian bioregion by most zoologists and biologists. And here are some of the elements that people are sensitive to, I think, about whether they feel at home in a place or not. And I inadvertently or somewhat deliberately put all these things into Ecotopia. One is that it has to be green. Now, you could write an Ecotopia about the Sahara if you wanted to, and it would be an interesting challenge to try and do it. I dearly wish, in fact, somebody would try. It would be really interesting. But in general, human beings like green. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. You know, going out and planting a tree is one of the most, how should I say, good, capital G, good things you can do. There's an old Greek proverb, by the way, that you have a civilization happening when people plant trees under whose shade they will never be able to sit. And I think, yeah, that's getting close to something really important. Another part about it is that we are creatures of the water cycle, and we had better be able to relate to that physically as well as by turning on a tap and hoping that clear drinkable water will come out of it. One of the things the Ecotopians did was to open up the street, Market Street, the main drag of San Francisco, and let the creek that had once run down that neighborhood run above ground again so that people could see it. Because seeing water flow is a big, big deal. I mean, any kid could tell us that, but we tend to forget it when we grow up. It's important to take care of our creeks, our waterfronts, our rivers, and so on and so forth, because there's a special kind of lifeliness going on there. And of course, another element of Ecotopia is that it's clean, not in the sense of being antiseptic, but it's not polluted, the air is not dangerous to breathe, the water is not dangerous to drink, drink and so on. This makes people, this kind of elements of a vision make people feel comfortable, and we all like to be, stimulated, but we also like to be comfortable. Part of this, I think, is what architects and so on, planners, too seldom do, which is to envisage a world that is a habitat suitable for our species. It's hard to actually say what human nature is, as you all realize, I'm sure. But we have some idea. I mean, we're not cats who wander around solitarily. We are a groupy sort of a species. We're kind of playful. We're at least reasonably smart. We're talkative. We like to play around. We're spontaneous and so on. And what have we invented? We have invented a world of high-rise buildings where people sit by the hundreds in little cubicles. A world in which, although in a certain sense we have leisure, we are also a heavily overworked people, where we don't even take vacations that we're entitled to because we're afraid that if we leave the office, somebody else might move into our cubicle by the time we come back. We would like, I think, a world which felt good to us as animals, where we would feel not only warm and dry, but where the environment would be variable. This is another beef I have with architects who like to make, beautiful grids like that. Nature doesn't have beautiful grids. Nature has incredible variety, and we as a species have evolved to deal with that. Excuse me. Somebody said, it wasn't me, that the challenge of modern life is to attain the Stone Age village standard of life. That is to say, to have lives that are challenging, variable. Do you all realize one of the things we learned in researching this book about buffalo is that the diet of Indians in the middle of this country was incredibly more varied than the diet of modern so-called civilized people. They ate hundreds of different things. We only eat a couple, despite the variety of our supermarkets. And I think we miss the extraordinary vitality and flexibility and, for that matter, beauty of the natural world that we have in our, quest for whatever it is left behind. Another thing that people like about Ecotopia, the vision, is that it emphasizes a side of our human nature that is usually downgraded or denigrated in modern life, which is our cooperative side. Actually, humans, we're a kind of aggressive species. We like especially to defend our little territories and so on. But we are capable of a very amazing amount of cooperation, which too often gets deployed in things like wars. There's a wonderful book, in case you're interested in the experimental literature about this, there's a wonderful book called No Contest by a man named Alfie Kohn, who reviewed all the experimental psychology that had been done, comparing how people achieve in highly competitive contexts and how they achieve what their performance levels are in highly cooperative contexts. And guess what? People always do much better in collaborative, cooperative contexts. It's absolutely open and shut evidence. It surprises the hell out of people who like to pretend that the way you get people to perform well in business or other bureaucratic things is to set them at each other and make them all scared and maybe they'll do better. It's not true. It's not true. In Ecotopia, people live and work in small organizations, and the situation is such that they really have to work together. It's an entirely employee-owned economy, for one thing. So if you're in a company working with a bunch of other people, you own the company. You're not going to be out to sabotage the boss's interests because he's a lousy so-and-so. You're going to be trying to maximize the welfare and the performance and the amenities of your life in the enterprise, because that's where you live. The life quality, how should I say, the quality of life of the people working in an establishment is also a product of that establishment. It's not a byproduct, it's a product of the establishment. And if you own it, you can recognize that. Book People, which made it possible for me to self-publish Ecotopia when nobody in New York would touch it, was an employee-owned book distributing company. And at a certain point, the Book People people decided that they didn't want to go out to at lunchtime, they didn't want to go out to the roach wagon trucks that stop in front of industrial establishments and buy, prefabricated sandwiches. They wanted some real food. So they discussed this among themselves and decided that they would hire a chef. And they did hire a chef. And the result was that when I had business to do at Book People, I always contrived to arrive about 11 o'clock and do my business, and then they'd say, "Why don't you hang around for lunch?" And they had very nice lunches. But regular companies can't do that, at least not regularly publicly owned companies, because it infringes on the holy bottom line. When you have employee-owned companies, you can do a lot of things that you could not get away with, even as an enlightened manager of a stockholder-owned company. Also, in Ecotopia, because of the way the institutions are, people are able to counter some of the wearing away of human bonds that happens under especially highly market-oriented capitalism. Marx said a lot of good things. He's out of fashion now, but one of the things he said was that the cash nexus, that is to say the bond between people, if you can call it a bond, which occurs in the act of buying and selling, is a corrosive which eats away all other bonds. It's not only that, it's worse than Marx thought, because it eats away inside ourselves also. It eats away the way we think about what we're doing. We say, well, if I go and do this, it's going to cost me so many hours. It might be an activity I love, like going fishing or something, but it's going to cost me. I won't be putting that time in selling widgets or doing whatever else I do. And that kind of monetizing of the interior landscape is something that Ecotopians have the leisure not to do, because they only work 20 hours a week. The reason they don't work 20 hours a week is that they think that 20 hours a week is plenty to produce enough basic stuff for people. Basic food, basic possessions, basic shelter, basic amenities. And there are a lot of people who turn out to believe that. I just guessed at it when I was writing the book. But it turns out that when you do sober economic analyses, I don't know whether some of them may have been going on here at the Institute, that's something what it takes to maintain life as we know it without a huge overburden of stuff on top of it. And if you're working 20 hours a week, you are approaching the Stone Age standard. Because when you look at so-called primitive people, that's about as much as they work to provide what they need. So we are slaves to work, but the Ecotopians they like to work together. They have a lot of fun. It's hard in Ecotopia to distinguish work from play. A friend of mine once invented a term for this. He said we ought to talk in terms of plurk, play plus work, because it ought not to be a sharp division. We ought to be able to combine the two. Now, Ecotopia was maybe born out of despair at the way things were going. Believe it or not, in the 70s, things seemed to be pretty terrible, although they're 10 times more terrible now in ecological terms. But it wasn't a response to crisis in the way that the environmental movement has usually been trying to scare us into doing good things by telling us the terrible things that are about to happen. It was a desire to imagine better other ways of doing things. Schellenberger and Nordhaus attack this kind of thinking very vigorously, and I won't attempt to do it. But what I would say is that normally the environmental movement has relied on the stick And Ecotopia is a fresh, tasty, organic carrot. Now I want to turn to another kind of, of looking at these things. You may remember that Stuart Brand, a very brilliant editor, put out a thing called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was probably widely known in Vermont at one time. And in the first issue, he wrote something that bothered me at the time. He wrote that we are as gods. He was thinking of our new technology. We might as well get good at it. But Ecotopia is premised on a far more modest idea, the idea that we are animals, and we'd be happier if we got good at that. To get people to recognize that they are an animal species is very difficult, actually, as I've discovered over the years. But it can be done. And I think that if you recognize that we are a species, you will look at sustainability in a sounder way than some people do. There are business people, you know, who talk about sustainability, and what they mean is that the profit curve should keep on going up. I don't think anybody would take that very seriously in this room. What we have to, let me just run down a few of the characteristics that Ecotopians put into practice and that I think we all recognize are the parts that an Ecotopian vision of the future is going to have. Sustainable agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. And we have to remember that sustainability has, as well as, you know, Lester Brown of the World Watch Institute produced a pretty good definition of, although it's very human-centric, I think, that sustainability is acting to fulfill your needs without jeopardizing the needs of future generations. And he's only talking about people. We can't really do that if we're talking about ecosystems, really, and true sustainability. We have to talk about systems in which nutrient loss is minimized, in which things go round and round again, in which all species thrive. So we have to have that in our agriculture, forestry, fisheries. We probably have to have pretty much total recycling in all industrial and construction materials. We'd have energy sources in solar, wind, ocean thermal, biomass, and so on. We'd have very low energy consumption. Efficiencies modeled on nature. And incidentally, if you're looking for a wonderful, although difficult book to read, I recommend Biomimicry by Janine Benes, who talks about we are beginning to learn how to do things we want to do industrially without what is conventionally called the heat, beat, and treat technology that we have been relying on. Nature doesn't heat, beat, and treat. It does all these incredibly wonderful things. How can we learn how to mimic that? In the room we have John Todd, who's developed a lot of ways to do that kind of thing in handling sewage and various other kinds of things we have to take care of. We need to get anywhere in all this a very wide understanding of the principles of ecology. And I imagined in the book that Ecotopians learn a lot about ecology and nature from a very, very early age. They're an extremely outdoorsy people, for one thing. They're always out there camping and hiking and looking around. Their schools are very outdoorsy, and they are living in a circumstance where most people live with a shared understanding of their biological rules on Earth. The reason I wrote this little book, Ecology, a Pocket Guide, is that I came to the realization about 7 or 8 years ago that I didn't understand a lot of the things that I was assuming that my Ecotopians understood, and that I'd better figure them out and write them down. So it's a sort of glossary, I guess you could call it. It defines, in ordinary language, no mathematics, no diagrams, no nothing, although it does have a couple of illustrations, about 60 basic terms that you really need to have a grasp of if you're going to be a responsible public official, business person, ordinary citizen, farmer, industrial person, anybody. This is the sort of Ecotopian citizen's guide to ecology. One thing the Ecotopians understand is that decentralization is good. We used to say in the 60s and 70s that small is beautiful, and now we can add to that decentralization is good. And partly it's technical, as well as fitting our species better, because we are not, I mean, imagine if we were suddenly transported to a desert isle, the group in this room, there are too many of us to have it work very well, really. Maybe we'd have enough for 2 islands. But for example, in energy policy, the reason decentralization is good, and I was thinking about this for wind power in the Great Plains. The winds are the Great Plains are extremely windy. When you have an electrical power grid, the losses in distributing the power across the grid to distant places are greater. The cost of that are greater than the cost of generating the power in the first place. That means that decentralized multiple sources have an inherent advantage over big centralized ones of the kind that our business philosophy favors. The same thing is true of a tremendous number of other activities like food production, for example. We are currently, thanks to very cheap oil, we are currently in a system where it makes some kind of sense to bring apples from New Zealand or Chile and so on and so forth. We all like that in a short-term view while we can afford it, which probably won't be very much longer. But it's kind of crazy if you look at it from a biological point of view. I mentioned that the Ecotopians had extended families, not patriarchal or even, for that matter, matriarchal, although the Ecotopians, by the way, could be accused of being matriarchal in some ways because the dominant party, which is called the survivalists, that's turned out not to be too happy a name, but I invented it before the, people who want to go back in the woods with heavy firearms and so on took it over. But the dominant party is led by women, although it's not an anti-man party. And going back to the living patterns, human beings have, until very recently, lived in large families for obvious reasons of mutual support and safety and so on and so forth. In the long run, these will probably come back. But I imagine in Ecotopia, these large dwelling units might be defined in many ways besides blood relationships. For example, there might be people who want to eat in a special way, vegetarians or, for that matter, hunters and meat eaters, I don't know. By profession, by age, by religious or philosophical views, by gender or sexual preferences, by regional origins, and so on and so forth. But living in groupy ways has so many advantages over individual. The ideal of the consumerist establishment is that we should all live individually in studio apartments, each with a full range of appliances and at least one car. This is not, in my opinion at least, a very human vision. It's hard to be with other people in intense relationships, but we like it anyway. It's the way we are. We're equipped for it. Another thing about Ecotopia is that it's a very small country. It had about 15 million people to start with and began to decline slightly. It has a militia for self-defense, harking back to our colonial ancestors in places like Vermont. It doesn't want to throw its weight around in the world. It's fairly isolationist, actually. Is this feasible in the modern world, by the way? Well, globalization advocates will say no, but I'm not so sure. We are gradually coming to understand that, as some of its proponents have blurted out in the beginning, globalization is really a shorthand for U.S. domination of the world, or at least Northern domination of the world, and that globalization rests upon a lure of the lowest cost for everything, which might sound okay until you realize that that means the lowest cost for people also. And right now we're pretty expensive people, we Americans, which is one of the reasons why a lot of things are happening. But merely talking about low cost, as if that is the goal of a society to produce stuff at low costs, will not get you very far toward a desirable world, a world in which people would really enjoy living, would really thrive. Now I want to end, before we get into questions and answers, by saying something about present reactions to the book. It was very, very popular for a while. There are still a lot of young people who come across it somehow or other. When we were getting ready for the 30th anniversary edition, a young woman who is actually the daughter of a friend of ours said that she had been in New York in a used bookstore and had been fumbling through the books, and a book fell out of the shelf on her head. And she picked it up, and it was Ecotopia. And she said, well, that looks curious. I'll buy it and read it. So she read it, And she came back to California and informed her parents that she liked the book, but she thought the author must be dead because she couldn't find a website for him. And they said, well, no, he's alive and well. We saw him at a party a couple of weeks ago, actually. And this led me to whip out and put up her website, by the way. But her reactions to the book were very interesting to me. She's, what, 20 years old, 21 years old now, a student at Berkeley. And she's an artist and a photographer. And to her, Ecotopia offered a refuge or a sanctuary from some of the things she finds to be really repulsive in modern life. And there are a fair number of kids out there who read Ecotopia and they think, well, maybe it's a little old-fashioned in the way people dress or something, but it's not exactly, ancient history. And in my view, it continues to express some basic permanent human longings for a decent life. Whereas actually, we talk about all the progress we make, but if you look back over the last 20 years or so, you realize that we've in fact been sinking further and further into a kind of a degradation of the natural and indeed of the social world. There is a wonderful man, the co-inventor of the term bioregionalist, actually, Raymond Dassman, a zoologist, an expert in deer in California, who wrote a book in 1965, mind you. He wrote The Destruction of California. And what he was talking about was the impact of a rising population on the natural world of California, and it looked pretty appalling to him. Now we look back at 1965 and we think that was the promised land. Things have gotten much, much, much worse. There's a great movie called Network, written by Patty Chayefsky, in which it concerns television. The chief character, whose name I can't dredge up at the moment, ends up by saying, he leans out a window and he screams into the street, "We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore." And the masses respond, and everything, I think, gets sort of at least pseudo-changed. What we face now, though, I think, is the question of whether people are going to grow impatient with the way in which our society has been evolving and try to begin to envisage, in a very, lots and lots and lots of people doing it, try to envisage some other ways of doing things. And it's pretty chancy what they might decide, because we are probably going to be deprived of a lot of the comforts that we have gotten used to in the oil age. We are probably going to have to cope with the fact that our government has become more and more dysfunctional in the way that imperial governments do. And at some point, we are probably going to find people willing to move. The question will be, in what direction do we move? Do we move toward some kind of fascism, of which you can see plenty of precursors, imperial fascism, or do we move toward something you might call ecotopian? And in this struggle, I think visions, which we all have the capacity to generate. I mean, you can make an ecotopian visage for your apartment, for your house, for your farm, whatever, for your state. We all have the capacity to, I wouldn't call it dreaming, because people think dreaming is not realistic, but visioning is something else. Even corporations do it. Shell Oil commissions people to do scenarios that are really visions. One way lies green, one way lies chaos, as Pacific Gas and Electric, our biggest utility in California, says. So I hope that ecotopian thinking will remain some kind of steady little beacon of hope that as this terrible choice comes before us, we will make some kind of right choice. Now here I'll stop, and we have about 20 minutes in which we can talk, and I welcome questions, and they don't have to be terribly friendly, believe it, I can take it, or comments or whatever. Yes?
I was wondering if you ever were asked to put the book in a movie, in a movie format, and if you ever thought of how to translate these images and this concept into something that would appeal to a larger public. So you don't really preach, but you feel that you're connected immediately to that kind of vision.
People have been thinking about a movie for a long time, but nobody's ever been able to bring it off right. You know, when you read the book, it's a sort of a diary book, and the progress of the book is actually very interior. Weston, the hero, comes to Ecotopia. He's scared of it. He thinks they're barbarians. He thinks terrible things are happening out there. Gradually, he begins to understand what is good about Ecotopia. He falls in love also, which helps. And in the end, he is redeemed. Now, this is not the kind of a story you can easily film. What films are mostly about, I mean, big budget films, are some kind of adventure, some kind of conflict, some kind of struggle. And nobody's ever been able to invent, including me, a suitable struggle which won't just become a mere struggle like all the other struggles that are on the screen, but which actually means something ecologically, and where what Hollywood people would think of as the backdrop, the ecological backdrop, is still accurately and honestly done. I wish somebody would come along who could do it. Because as a, spending much of my life as a film critic, I have a very healthy interest in the power of media. On the other hand, you can overemphasize the power of media. It's probably true that on the whole, media are relatively conservative and they follow along. If we had 30 million people in the country who were convinced that Ecotopia was the direction they want to go, you'd begin to see movies made for them of one kind or another. I'm not sure what the kind they would be, but in the meantime, I wish there were kids out there with video cameras, doing. It is possible to certainly do ecotopian documentaries about manageable small issues, which many times involve dramatic struggles, lots of good people and lots of rotten people, and you could have, titanic contests. So I always encourage folks who want to make movies using ecotopian ideas, ecotopian imagery. There are quite a few films out there that deal with ecological ideas. There's one called The Emerald Forest by John Boorman, who is a very serious director. It's kind of a fantasy, a little bit kooky in some ways, but it's a very powerful, very beautifully done movie. And there are some others. But none of the usual prospects have shown any interest into it. Like Robert Redford. People sometimes say Robert Redford will save the world by making ecological movies. Well, he's had the chance to take Ecotopia and run with it, and Jane Fonda the same way. I had visions of Jane Fonda playing originally my heroine, who is a woman of 30-something, and now I have visions of her playing the president of the country, who is a woman of 60-something, but not yet. Yes?
To what extent do you think of Ecotopia still as timeless? How might Ecotopia look different taking this project on today, with today's situation?
Well, in a certain way, it wouldn't look very different at all, because the book is very conservative and very solid, I like to think at least, very solidly based on the underlying necessities. Certain technological details would, of course, change, like there'd be more ethanol-driven cars, probably, and things like that. But the rudiments of the society, the basic elements of society, I think would have to stay pretty much the same. Not to say that people can't write other kinds of ecotopias. I would love to see ecotopias, a different ecotopia for every bioregion of the world, because, excuse me, you always face different cultural circumstances, different, obviously, natural resource possibilities, and different senses of what's important in life could lead to. That's why this Green Hawaii book is really interesting, because Hawaii is culturally very different from Northwest, U.S. And he makes, I think, a credible attempt to do that. But so far, nobody has done it except for Roter and myself. And one of the reviews of Ecotopia that came out right after it appeared, that I'm very proud of, came from a journal in Portland, Oregon called Rain, which was a sustainability journal, although not using the name. The review said, "It looks easy, like the wheel." Yes, John.
What's science like in emerging ecotopia?
Well, for one thing, all the university professors have to take a year off every other year and go out into society and do something real. For another thing, You know, I sometimes despair of the caution of our grant-making institutions, how extremely reluctant they are to take big dares. The Ecotopian grant-making institutions set aside a certain bundle of money for really crazy, far-out things. And most of them don't work, but occasionally something works. And the research establishment is very decentralized, and the universities are also kind of student-run. So you can imagine things are very different on the research side within universities. I imagined Ecotopians as being very clever people, like you. I mean, going out and trying strange things that nobody would have imagined who was caught up in the usual categories of academic thinking. The growth that we have in ideas and, for that matter, technology usually comes when two fields, it's kind of tectonic. Two fields come together that don't normally talk together, and something remarkable happens. The Ecotopians know that very well. And they also, well, you know, the principles of ecology, so-called, in this book are kind of different from the principles of mathematics or something where you have axiomatic foundations and then you build upward from that. Ecological thinking is like a net that you put around an orange or something. Everything's interconnected and they all come at each other from different angles. So you can't say, well, if we understand DNA, we can understand everything. Actually, that turns out not to be true. Watkins and everybody at that time of Watson, they thought that was true, that was the key to the universe, and now science was over and everybody could go home and watch television or something. But in actual fact, the interconnections and pressures and balancings and so on that go on in any system of thought, any respectable system of thought at any rate, maybe we have to leave traditional economics out of this, I'm not sure. They're always non-hierarchical. And the Ecotopians would embrace that, whereas the traditional American university fights against that to the last budget dollar. You know, it's not the, yes.
What does Ecotopia have to say about its formalized religion?
Well, in a word, nothing.
Is there formal?
Yeah, in a word, nothing. They're obvious. You know, all religions are syncretic, I think is the term. They borrow from each other. If you look at Christianity, actually, there's a tremendous amount of other stuff that has flowed into it, and the same seems to be true of Asian religions and so on. So there are traces of Christianity in Ecotopia. For example, they have an institution called ritual warfare, which is modeled on something that actually probably happens to this day in New Guinea, where people go out, teams from factories or offices or universities or whatnot, go out onto a field and they try to stab each other with spears. It's pretty messy. And it stops whenever anybody gets hurt. Big wound or little wound, whatever, they stop. And the victim, or the woundee, gets laid down on a stretcher and carried away to their ample medical facilities. And the stretcher is marked with a red cross. Now it's a long red cross. It's not the typical American Red Cross, but it's a little bit maybe like the Christian cross. And they make little speeches which are ritualized about why did you do this. And the central character of the book is we would call her a timber cruiser. She goes out into the woods to mark trees that are to be cut, and implicitly those are not to be cut. And whenever she does this, she has a little ceremony where she speaks to the trees. And some of the people, either in the book or people who have read the book, say she's a kind of a druid or something, and I say, well, maybe something like a druid. And I was going to write a book about Weston's children coming to Ecotopia, and they would regard her as a witch, and maybe they'd be right. But the Ecotopians, I suppose, have a sort of a reverence for the universe that is some new kind of religion, and I don't know where its roots. I didn't really get into that. There are.
I think you're going back to some of the old religions.
Well, yes, there are people who interpret the Gaia hypothesis that I mentioned earlier, for example, as the basis of a religion of the Earth's living systems. And Lynn Margulis, the co-inventor of it, who's a friend of mine, has strong objections to this because she thinks it leads to kind of sappy, sentimental religion, where Gaia will save us from ourselves. And she says, Gaia just does its stuff. And if we know how, if we're smart enough to live with that, good. If not, well, too bad. But people yearn for some kind of overarching religious spirit of things. And I myself believe that in the long, long run, which, you know, excuse me, I may not be here to see, the struggle to save the earth, if we want to use that wonderful old phrase, is a spiritual struggle, because economics and intelligent technological analysis in themselves will not do it. We have to have a system of values which are ultimately spiritual and religious, or maybe religious values, to provide a sort of a substrate for what we think we're doing here. And so I actually welcome very much the entrance of religious groups into the environmental movement or the ecological movement, whatever you call it. I hope they get really serious about it. Yes?
I'm hearing discussion in terms of the emergence of a new idea or a more compelling vision that will just draw people away from the way things are now. And I'm carried back momentarily to the Vietnam War era, where I witnessed a young student get up and burn his draft card, and he said, "I don't have a credit card, but if I had one, I would burn one." And the sentiment then was that we're in a situation where the military-industrial complex needs our bodies and our minds, our cooperation, you know, and they're not going to let us go easily. That there has to be a conflict to shake that off. But do you see a way in which this ecotopia can emerge without having a struggle comparable to what people were facing then?
I hope so, although in the book as it stands, there was a war called the Helicopter War, in which after the Ecotopian states seceded, there was an attempt by what we would now call the homeland to recapture this land, and it was a war. A lot of helicopters were shot down, actually, by the Ecotopian militia. And you remember when Quebec separatism was at its height, the question was whether Quebec province could peacefully secede from the rest of Canada, and they came pretty close to doing it. And they may yet, I don't know. One hopes, though, that in a larger sense, I'm a gradualist, really. I believe that, and here's another smart thing that Marx said, the new society is born in the womb of the old. So when we look around us now, we ask, well, what's being gestated around here? And some of it is not very pretty. I was mentioning the possibility of a sort of fascist empire being gestated. But we also see, and if you want to see some really good parts of that, Lester Brown's new book, Plan B, version 2, is a pretty up-to-date summary of all the many wonderful things that are happening, gradualistic things that are happening that are beginning to nibble away at the, let's say, evil empire of industrial capitalism, and beginning to transform it in interesting ways. Whether it will be sufficient or not, probably none of us in this room will live to know. But the way I look at it, that's the struggle of our time. And people of goodwill and good conscience can put their shoulder to the wheel and hope to turn it a little bit toward the good side. Social change in the modern world is often surprisingly volatile. I mean, if we look at Iran, for example, after the CIA overthrew Mossadegh, the elected progressive leader of Iran, and put the Shah in his place, the Shah had the world's single biggest, proportionally, Secret Service, Air Force, everything we could possibly give him. Then the old guy with the beard comes back from Paris, Khomeini, and in about 3 or 4 months, the Shah and everything is gone. The Shah is running for his life. And although Iran is not America, it's possible that very sudden political changes can happen anywhere in the world. We don't know. It's in a way, we have to get ready, I suppose. Part of the Ecotopian vision is simply to understand how we would run things differently if we had the chance. What would we do about electric power, about getting people around, about moving food, about growing food, about regulating forestry and fisheries and so on? we need to practice all that stuff. Whether we'll get to do it or not, we still need to learn. We need to learn how. Yeah.
I wonder if you could, I haven't read Ecotopia, if you could address the money system that Ecotopians use and if it differs from our conventional interest-bearing money system at all, or how it works.
The money system doesn't vary, but the investment system does. There is no absentee ownership of enterprises in Ecotopia. They are all owned by the people who do the work. Now this means that if you want to start an enterprise, where do you go for capital? Well, you go to the National Bank. So the lending policies of the National Bank begin to do some of the things that our venture capitalists and so on do here. But money, I left, conventional. They might very well try let systems or something like that, but I didn't get into that level of detail about it. Yeah.
Are there any internal threats to the continued existence of Ecotopia that are unique to Ecotopia and not kind of the general litany of ills? I'm curious in particular about the role of diversity, especially as you globalize Ecotopia.
Well, there's a political opposition called the progressivists, actually, who want to restore industrial consumerist business as before the independence. In terms of system disruption and so on, I don't think so. The region Ecotopia occupies is an amazingly, we do have volcanoes and earthquakes and so on, but it's an amazingly stable and habitable part of the world. So I didn't envisage things like that giving them any trouble. Incidentally, if you're interested in the 30th anniversary edition of Ecotopia, which has a afterword by the author explaining what it felt like to have this little book rejected by everybody in New York go on and turn into the little book that could, you can't get it at the local bookstores, I've discovered, but if you Google Heyday Books, that will take you into their catalog, and you can order it online. I sort of hate to have people buying books, from far away, one at a time, but it's the way, unfortunately, the bookstore business has gone lately. And it's even a little cheaper than a Bantam edition, I think. There's been a hand up in the back here. Yeah.
You mentioned the concept between competition and collaboration. What was the interpretation of Darwin?
Well, they would recognize Darwin in the sense that that kind of competition is, in fact, they would say that their system of society will probably in the end outcompete the rest of the world because it's more stable and survivable. And that in biological terms it's superior, and that they would be glad to compete with the rest of the world. In internal competition, human biology is very, well, not that unusual, but somewhat unusual. Because we are capable of cooperation to a degree that most other species are not. There's a lot of cooperation going on among other species, like elephants, for example, which we haven't recognized until just very recently. But, and the Ecotopians are very competitive in terms of excellence. One of the things about science and technology and so on is that there are a lot of real hotshot young Ecotopians who are, trying to figure out really new, ingenious stuff. And when they do, it's not that they get rich, because the enterprise system doesn't really, permit that or conduce to that. But they are very proud of themselves when they do something. There's one little research group in the book that is working on something that is described a little bit in biomimicry. They are trying to figure out how to extract electric potential directly from plants. And there are people now trying to do this with algae, I believe, and getting somewhere, actually.
One last question.
Okay.
There are a number of bioregions around the U.S. that are actually considering secession from the United States. And Vermont is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Wants to, want to create a utopia here. And wants to have your advice for us.
Go for it. No, I'm on the list for the Vermont Commons group, and I somehow came across Frank Bryan's book Out, exclamation point, which appears, it's not even in print anymore apparently. It's a wonderful story. I mean, you may not realize what an advantage Vermont has. There are only 8 roads coming in and out of the state. You could blockade them all with a couple of dozen people.
On that note, thanks.